I had no idea what it was. So I just, drop the JSOW, kind of truck into the zone, got my FLIR up, and out of the corner of my eye, I'll never forget, out of the corner of my eye, I see this kind of blossom, like build like on the ground, and I was immediately thinking, heads up, missile launch. Tell my wingman, and he goes, dude, that was your JSOW blowing up. And then I look at my FLIR and I can see all the little bomblets impacting. So what I thought was a missile launch, bloom, it was actually just all my bomblets blowing up.
Tower to my stations, release you, runway 4 left, wind 040 at 5, clear for takeoff.
Seat tied, altimeter 0 eyes, we're clear for takeoff, clear for the airspace. Viper check 2. Viper right ramp curve was at 354. So yeah, that's on. Next picture, 610, 15,000, Viper 1 target.
Farley, thanks for joining me on the podcast. Happy to have you on here.
Yeah, thanks, Rain. Appreciate it. Happy to be here.
It's good to get some more Navy representation. I've had a few Hornet guys on the podcast, so now you're adding to the mix. But you got some Air Force time. Looks like in your bio. We'll dig into that. We'll dig into Top Gun. You got a book coming out here in November, which again would be fun to talk about that and just the journey from being a fighter pilot to writing a book. I don't even know.
Yeah.
I guess I can't write good, so I couldn't do it. So that's why
none of us can. That's the problem.
It's good to have smart people out there that can polish this thing up. So we'll talk about that process. But I want to jump into it. Can you just give me a little bit of background of who you are and how you got to where you're sitting today?
Yeah. But that's a long journey, right? I mean, I think everybody in the military has had similar experiences, all come from different backgrounds. I grew up in the Seattle area. Went to the Naval Academy, graduated in 1999, did the whole Navy flight training route that ended up in Virginia Beach, flying the F-18. Flew the Hornet, active duty in 2 squadrons. Did 3 deployments on 3 different carriers, and then ended up an instructor in Kingsville flying the T-45 Goshawk. Wanted to get back to the Hornet, so my last I guess would be 12 years were in VFA 204 in New Orleans as an adversary. And part of that time was as a traditional reservist when I went out and got a job flying for the airlines and realized I've got a lot of time on overnights, so let me start writing a book, because that's what every fighter pilot wants to do, right, is write a book. Yeah. So
things you never thought you'd say. It's funny how that path kind of progresses for a lot. Funny story too is I took a cable in New Orleans. I took it during the air show, But
I think I heard that in one of your episodes. Yeah,
I took the departure in cable, so all the Hornet guys just gave me a lot of grief for that. But again, for a Viper guy, it's a significant emotional event.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I've taken the long field gear before also, and it's pretty nerve wracking seeing the end of the runway coming up and you haven't stopped yet. So.
I guess it's a different perspective. I'm thinking an approach and arrestment would be absolutely terrible, which there are definitely emergencies. And that one, in fact, had I recognized it earlier, would have driven an approach and arrestment versus the departure and arrestment. But, the jet stopped on the runway, so a win's a win. I'll take it.
Exactly. Any landing you can walk away from, right?
Right. Yeah, 100%. Actually, it's interesting. The Navy doesn't have a ton of reserve type flying billets. Like the Adversary Air is kind of it for the most part. Am I right?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. There used to be a traditional reserve air wing. So basically an entire air wing that you would find on an aircraft carrier. They had Tomcats, they had E2s, they had Hornets. Basically everything that you would put on a carrier, they had a reserve air wing. That ended up becoming what they now call the tactical support wing. And so there's a Growler squadron that augments the active duty Growlers doing electronic attack. And then they've got adversary squadrons. There's the one in Virginia Beach that flies a Super Hornet, VFC 12. Then there's VFC 111 down in Key West flying the F5, and VFC 13 in Fallon. They're now flying the F16, which should have come to New Orleans. Just want to put that out there. And then New Orleans, is flying the F5 now. Flying the Hornet when I was there, but now the F5.
Oh, I didn't realize they transitioned to the F5. That's new and
late breaking pretty much the day after I retired.
And I'm gone.
Yeah.
F5 I think would be a fun plane to fly. But then again, I've never flown one, so maybe it's terrifying. But having the leading edge slats versus the T-38 with no slats, I think gives you a little bit more maneuverability.
Yeah, if you talk to any of the F5 pilots, they'll tell you it's a great plane to fly. Obviously did a lot of dissimilar with them, did a lot of joint red air events with them. So, I've seen it flying a lot, fought it a lot, but I just didn't think that with the amount of time I was able to commit to the squadron that I could do it safely. So it was a good time for me to bow out.
Yeah, that's the tough part, right? I had a commander, and I think his thing was like, at some point you have to hang it up, and it's either on your terms or when the military's saying you hang it up. For me, that was definitely one of the factors I thought about, is like, if I'm double commuting to my airline job and to my squadron, also, by the way, I'm not that good, and the tactics continue to evolve, the technology continues to evolve. It's it is if to be good, it is absolutely a full-time job plus some. Unless you're just a genius, like I guess maybe Elon Musk or a lot of the buddies I flew with, but not for me. You got to be in the books, you got to be in the vault, you got to be practicing flying all the time.
Yeah, you absolutely do. And that was, one of the things that I realized in my last few years in the squadron. I'd done the events that, we did Red Air for so many times that I could just kind of do it just on habit. But I realized that my tactics were really dated. I went through the course in 2009 and things had changed considerably, since then. So
that's why I thought doing air shows for 2 years, not doing anything tactically, jumping back into it, the plane, some of the, the tactics had evolved, the plane was starting to evolve with some of the additional sensors and things that were going into it with as far as software. It's a fast moving ball game, and if you're not always in it, there's a huge learning curve. I couldn't imagine like jumping back into it today. It definitely would blow my little mind, so to speak. So, not where it would be. Yeah. I want to talk. So you did 2 operational assignments in the Hornet. Talk to me a little bit about what it was like during those assignments for you. Because it's kind of the heat of Iraq and Afghanistan, depending on where you're hitting the cycle. But talk to me about that.
Yeah, so my first deployment, I was with VF-87, the Golden Warriors out of Virginia Beach. We cruised on the Roosevelt, and this was the very beginning of the Iraq War. So we were actually still in our workup, so we're off the coast of Florida. They've got several pre-deployment training exercises that you participate in as an air wing, as a carrier, as a strike group. And we were in the middle of that when we got the call, hey, we're gonna head straight over the Atlantic into the Med and start Operation Iraqi Freedom. So we didn't even, come home like we were supposed to around Christmas time. We just, boom, headed over. And so we ended up in the Eastern Med, and this is the very beginning part of the war, when we still didn't know if the Iraqis were going to send up MiGs like they did in Desert Storm. And so we flew the first missions with both the air-to-air and air-ground loadout. The Roosevelt was one of 2 carriers in the Med that supported operations in northern Iraq. So we flew through Turkey and then entered Iraq from the north, primarily close air support for SOF and OGA, like CIA assets on the ground. And I can still remember the very first time flying in over Iraq. It was a pretty surreal experience, right? Because that was my first deployment, and here I am. We call them nuggets in the Navy, and I was a nugget flying on the wing of a very experienced aviator who had flown missions in Afghanistan after 9/11. Because the squadron that I joined, they were on the Enterprise when 9/11 happened on their way home, and the carrier turned around. So they were some of the first guys to fly missions into Afghanistan. And so these guys were experienced, and I'm new, don't know what to expect. And start to see AAA surface to air missiles coming up, and it was a pretty surreal experience for me. But going from that to my next deployment was night and day. ROE had completely shifted, and we'd won the war, mission accomplished, and all that. And so now we didn't drop bombs on my second deployment at all. Flew in Iraq from the Gulf, so in the south this time, and then also flew in Afghanistan. Neither one, we didn't drop any bombs. So it was a completely different experience.
That's wild how it goes. I want to find the dude or dudette that has the mission accomplished sign that was on the carrier when Bush when he landed. Like, that's got to be in. I pray, I hope, I have faith that's in some fighter pilot's bar in their in their garage or something somewhere. No telling where that thing ended up, but hopefully
Yeah.
not at the bottom of the ocean somewhere.
It should be in a museum somewhere.
It should. I don't think it's going to make it to a museum somewhere, but maybe not. The workup piece, that's something for any fighter squadron that happens prior to deployment. Looks a couple different ways. Obviously, if you're floating around on a big old boat, sounds like you take the big old boat out and go do that. What's a normal workup look like for, because you're I guess operate off the boat, and then you're probably using ranges and stuff that are land based to go drop ordnance and work with JTACs. So what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, for the most part. So there's several phases, right? So the first phase is crawl, walk, run mentality, right? So everything you do initially is all unit level training within your squadron. And you do what's called the Strike Fighter Advanced Readiness Program, and there's an air to ground and an air to air piece. And you go from 2-ship tactics to 4-ship tactics in both of those. And usually the air-to-air, it can be done locally. So in Virginia Beach, we had an adversary squadron, so we did it there. If you didn't have an adversary squadron that was able to support you, you might travel to Key West. So I got to do that a lot as an adversary, go to Key West. And then air-to-ground is typically done in Fallon just because of the ranges that we have. And most of those don't involve JTACs. You're not doing a whole lot of close air support training. But then you bring the air wing together in what's called air wing Fallon. So the entire air wing will go to Fallon, Nevada, and we'll start to do more strike packages. So we're now using electronic attack. We're using different elements that you would see launching from a carrier, but you're just launching from ground. And then the next phase you do is usually called a Comp 2X. I think it's composite training unit exercise. And that's where the air wing goes on the carrier, and now you're off the coast. So you're either going to be off the coast of Florida, because we've got a lot of good bombing ranges there, in Avon Park, Pine Castle, things like that. Or you're going to be off the coast of San Diego and using San Clemente Island as the range. In that case, the whole air wing will launch. There's different missions. It usually culminates in a notional war where there's certain ROE that has to be met. So you're doing a lot of taking off, intercepting, and escorting, making sure that they don't get within a certain range of the carrier. You're integrating the carrier's air defense capabilities as well. So you're starting to work with the cruiser that's the air defense commander, and it's just gradually growing and building to the point that now the Navy can say, okay, you're ready to deploy.
So everything you said, basically blacked out because I'm hearing all these locations that the Navy gets: San Diego, Florida, Key West, Virginia Beach, probably even, versus a lot of the spots that the Air Force goes.
Yeah, but
then
you didn't
I
hear
get
Fallon.
lost when the fact, Fallon. So Fallon's kind of like, yeah. But the flip side is at some point you have to go float around the ocean for 9 months, trapped on a metal container. So trade-offs. When we're talking the carrier strike group, that is run by like a 2-star. Is that kind of the normal vibe? Bringing
usually
all
a
these
1-star.
1-star. Does he have like are the subs and everything like that? That's part of the whole package.
Yeah, and it's so the admiral that's in charge of the strike group has everything. Frigates, cruisers, destroyers, subs. And there's usually an amphibious expeditionary group that's attached to it as well. But when I was a kid reading Tom Clancy, I thought that the strike group would go out to sea and you'd be surrounded by all these ships and just be this big package. What I didn't realize is that the admiral might tell the destroyer CO, hey, you're going to go do this counter piracy, operations. And so they detach and go, hundreds of miles away, and they're completely autonomous. I mean, one of the things about the Navy is that, a ship CO is the ultimate authority. So he's given a mission and go complete the mission. So honestly, when I was at sea, we probably saw, maybe 1 or 2 ships at most that were around the carrier the whole time. Now there were the ones that were under the water that I didn't see and had no clue where they were. But yeah, it was pretty interesting. The strike group is spread out.
Yeah, doing submarine things and other boat things.
Yeah.
talk to me a little bit about Top Gun. What's that process like getting selected, and then talk to me about Top Gun itself. Everyone's seen the movie, I assume. So
if you've seen the movie, I mean, that's pretty much it, right? You don't need to know anything else.
Go out there, overstress every single airframe.
Exactly. Yeah. And then just, drink a lot and play volleyball. In reality, there's basically a couple ways that you go to Top Gun. Usually it happens right after your first sea tour. So you have a 3-year sea tour. And if you get selected to be an instructor at one of the weapons schools, either on the East Coast or West Coast, an instructor on the staff at Top Gun, and there's a couple other billets. I think for the training squadrons for the F-18s, they have a billet. Some of the test squadrons have one as well. Then you would go through the class, and then it's changed now how long the class is, but it's about 8 weeks long. You go through the class, and then you go to wherever your assignment was. For me, I went through as an adversary. So, when you go through the class, you either go through as a fighter, an adversary, or a controller. They have controllers. We have like Marine controllers, intercept controllers, E2 controllers, shipboard controllers. They go through the class as well. So as an adversary, it was kind of nice because I had already done my sea tour, done my shore tour, and then had checked into the adversary squadron, and they said, okay, we're sending you to Top Gun. And so when you finish up as an adversary, because what you do is, as you're going through the course, you as adversary are in charge of all the red air. So when I went through, the admiral who was in charge of NSOC, now it's called NOTIC, but at the time, the Navy Strike and Air Warfare Center in Fallon, the admiral was one of the guys that was involved in the only Hornet shoot down in Desert Storm, Admiral Fox, and he was one of the wingmen on one of my sorties. So Admiral came in, I gave him the presentation. Admiral, this is your job. He's like, Roger that. And go out. So it was a pretty cool experience. The flying, I think, was top notch. I mean, long days. You'd wake up early. You'd brief your sortie. You go fly. You come back. Long in depth debriefs, and then you go to the O Club, and because there's really nothing else to do in Fallon. But it was just over and over. But it was fantastic flying. And then after graduating, go back to the squadron, and now you're an adversary instructor. So you're training the other guys in your squadron on the latest and greatest tactics. And then, you go to Key West and you do a 1v1 with a nugget that's getting ready for workups, and you BFM them, and you're basically just training them in air-to-air combat.
That's funny. Yeah. I've had Admiral Fox on the podcast twice. It's been great to talk to him and hear like his story.
Yeah,
for sure. So, for the Air Force, we have our aggressor squadrons. We have weapons school. Weapons school and Top Gun are often compared. I would like to talk about the integration piece, but it's probably more appropriate to talk about the integration piece with like our adversary squadron. So we send guys to go be adversary air, but they become SMEs, subject matter experts. Maybe they're in Russian missiles or Chinese missiles or radar systems, etc. And there's going to be one guy that's in charge of knowing about Russian radars.
Right.
To then teach the others. I assume the Navy probably does something comparable to that.
Yeah, we do. Every year, it's usually around tailhook. They have like what's called a re-red or a re-blue, where patch wearers go back to Fallon, and they give them an update on what the latest and greatest are on the tactics, both on the red side and on the blue side. And they've tried this before, where within TSW, each squadron has a specialty for kind of really what they're, whether they're going to be, Russian or Chinese or whatever. I don't think that's ever really stuck. So usually what happens is within the squadron, you have a person that's going to be a SME on a certain area. But all our events change. The threat changes for every single event, and we have to be able to replicate that threat regardless. So what ends up happening is usually most guys are pretty proficient in all of them, and you go, if you have a question, you go to the guy that just went through the class most recently, and you ask him, hey, what's the latest on this? What do I need to do? How do I replicate this threat radar or this aircraft? And they give you the latest. But it's not quite the same as the Air Force. I know when I went through the class, I kind of equated, my experience at Top Gun being kind of master's level. And I think the Air Force weapons school, I would equate that to being more of a, doctorate level.
Yeah, obviously, I never went to weapons school. The traditional flow for like a weapons officer, at least in the fighter community, is usually like 2 operational assignments on average. That's probably a fair thing to say. And then each base is probably going to pony up maybe 1 person every 6 months, maybe 2. Again, it just depends on how many squadrons are there. And then they're going to go spend 6 months just getting drugged through the mud. Doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun.
Yeah.
What's about the average? I mean, that squadrons in the Navy are sending guys and gals to Top Gun.
Well, it's not, like I said, because in order to go to Top Gun, you have to have one of those billets. It used to be Top Gun was when they called it power projection. I think squadron would send somebody. So like in the original movie, the squadron would send somebody, and then they would come back to the squadron then and sort of teach what they learned. Now when you go through Top Gun, now you go then to a weapons school staff or to the Top Gun staff or to the Nautic staff, and so you're kind of spreading out. Now, when you finish those weapons school tours, then you do what's called a training officer tour. So then you go to a squadron, and now you are the SME for tactics for that squadron.
Okay.
And so it's a little bit different. So every squadron has one training officer, but some squadrons have more than one, Top Gun graduate, just based on where they are in their career. Because then you go from being a training officer to being a department head, which is a O4 job. And then sometimes you have your XO and CO are also Top Gun graduates.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Because I'm thinking of like the first Top Gun movie, which is comparable to like a weapons school class where you're sent every, base is ponying up a couple people, and then they go to Las Vegas and they're a class of 8 people or 9 people. Mm-hmm. But then they have to go back to the operational squadron to be the tactician, to be the instructor that teaches the instructors. They have to do their time, as they say, for a year or 2, the patch payback. And then as they progress in their career, they're getting kicked off the staff, coming back as commanders and DOs. So,
right.
I mean, probably similarly, like any squadron has a few patches, but there's only one squadron weapons officer at the time. And
right.
He or she is the person that is driving all the tactics in the squadron. The commander and the DO at one point might have been the squadron patch.
Yep.
But now they're doing commander and DO things.
Yeah, that's pretty similar. Once you get to your training officer tour, then sounds it's the same.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, interesting. The adversary piece is something that obviously some people find a knack for. In the operational squadron, you're often having to fly adversary air, and you're supposed to go look at the adversary books and
right.
Yeah, do a threat replication that is realistic, not just go, hey, we're gonna go completely hose my buddy who's on his whatever upgrade ride.
Yeah, right.
Which is usually what ends up happening. But did you enjoy kind of learning about other nations and the tactics they use and trying to figure out the best way to replicate those?
I really did. I thought it was really fascinating, and it when I was in Nugget, right, going through SFARP, and you said, hey, your threat at the time, the big, the base one that we trained to was the MiG-29, and then the Su-27 ended up coming along later, and that was the big, bad, scary one. But you really had no idea what else was going on in the world. But as an adversary, you kind of get an idea of what each threat nation is doing and where they're going with their tactics and how they're training their pilots. And I thought it was a really cool experience to kind of get to see that and then go out and fly it and pretend to be one of those guys and try to give the guys who are getting ready to go on deployment an authentic experience that they can, use and apply in real world situations.
What was some of the challenges of being an aggressor?
I'd say the biggest challenge is ego, right? I mean, if I go out and I lose a fight, I should consider that a win, right? Because that means the fighters are ready to go defend
right.
the homeland, defend their carrier, right? So that the challenge was kind of leaving my ego at the door, understanding that there are training objectives, and when they've met the training objectives, that's a good thing. So that was probably the biggest challenge.
I could see that. Like if you're gonna be a mill power only adversary,
Yeah.
and then like if I just put in afterburner,
Right.
I can get the cues that I need here.
Right. Exactly. But then it was also nice when you could actually punish them when you see them make a mistake and you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna exploit your errors here. Talk to me about your time in Afghanistan, because you did a tour, or at least a deployment for a bit with the Tactical Air Control Party with the Air Force. Is that correct?
Yeah. So that was interesting. It was right after I graduated Top Gun. I returned to the squadron, and at the time, the Navy was not having very much success going kinetic in Afghanistan. So we had carriers that were operating the North Arabian Sea that were flying long sorties up into Afghanistan, spending a lot of time on station, working with JTACs, not satisfying the ROE, and then having to return to the ship, only to hear an F-16 check on right after and get cleared hot. So some brainchild on the Navy staff at the Pentagon said, well, it's because the ground force commander doesn't know how to use Navy assets. If we take some Navy TAC air guys and stick them in with the Army, then they can use them. And so there were 10 of us that were picked, and I was the lucky one from my squadron that got to go. I guess they figured because I just finished Top Gun and was very proficient in air-to-air tactics that I'd be the perfect person. But I went through the Joint Firepower course at Nellis, and then went through the Navy. They have called NIACT. It's like the individual augmentee combat training. It was at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where we got to run around the woods and play Army, driving Humvees and carrying M4s and doing that. And so we went to Fort Jackson, started communicating with the colonel that was in charge of all the JTACs and TACPs that were in Afghanistan, and he said, well, I don't know how to use you guys because doctrinally there isn't something called an air planner, which is what the Navy was calling us, air planners. So he said, I'm going to use you as ALOs. You're all tactical. You all have JTAC experience, so we're gonna use you as air liaison officers and send you out with individual TACPs, different FOBs. So that's what we did. Because we're all warfighters. Whatever we need to do to support the mission. So we go over there, and I can still remember sitting in the talk one day. The ground force commander is talking about an upcoming operation, and he's like, Air, what do we have available? And I said, well, you've got a B-1 with 2 hours of on-station time, a couple Strike Eagles with, an hour and a half, F-16s with an hour, A-10s with an hour, and 2 Hornets with 20 minutes. And he goes, well, what do you want to use? And I said, not the Hornets. I mean, I don't want just 20 minutes of on-station time. I want to have something that's there and persistent. And so we quickly realized this experiment was not going to work. And the Navy leadership was like, hey, what's going on? How come we're still not seeing, advantages? Like, it doesn't make sense. The Navy air wing exists in an expeditionary role to basically be there until we have a permanent sustained presence. So does it really make sense to have guys flying from a carrier all the way up into Afghanistan only having 20 minutes? Or maybe should we det a squadron to Kandahar and have them fly out of there? But, so that experiment failed after that one deployment. But
it is interesting how it goes. I've talked about on the podcast other things. My last point to OIR, the F-22 started getting in the mix, and the F-22 was dropping bombs. The Russians showed up, and there's some argument for some air dominance and making sure they don't do anything crazy. But it's also kind of silly, in Rain's humble opinion, to have this 5th gen fighter dropping bombs without a targeting pod into an uncontested environment. Now, if it's contested and you got double-digit SAMs and you need it to break across the fence, sure, there's a discussion and an argument for that. But let's not use it on the softball targets. We can use Vipers and Hornets, etc., for that. The on-station time is always a factor, and that, I think that'll always be something for a Viper that's an issue, for probably a Hornet coming from the boat that's an issue.
Yeah, F-35.
Painful as it is, a Strike Eagle with just bags of gas and tons of bombs.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I
have two
mean,
people
you have
sitting
to
there.
you have to pick the platform for the mission, and I think there's a lot of infighting that goes on, at least among the flag, general officer level, where they want to prove that their assets can do the mission, and I don't think maybe they should in all cases.
Yeah, if you need to go somewhere in a matter of days and put air power and force project somewhere, like turns out a boat with a bunch of Hornets on it, it's probably your Huckleberry.
Yeah,
It doesn't need it doesn't need a long runway and don't have to go take an airfield, but different tools in the tool bag for different problem sets depending on what presents itself.
absolutely. And in a landlocked country like Afghanistan, I mean, I think that an argument could be made that once you have a sustained presence, and you have, fighters and strike aircraft that are based there, you should use those, and if you need more, then debt more there. At least that was my belief. That was my opinion. But, I had a very, very granular view being on the ground and seeing, what I was seeing and knowing that, man, I love the Hornet and honestly, my JTACs, they love the Hornet too. They said, I would much rather, no offense, I would much rather pick a Hornet guy over a F-16 guy because it sounds like they're just kicked back in recliners, smoking a cigarette and having a drink when they're talking to you about ROE. And they're just very relaxed. And I take great pride in the fact that, Hornet guys are pretty good at close air support and are pretty relaxed at working with the JTACs on the ground, and they look to accomplish the mission. But if it's not the right asset, it's not the right asset.
Oh, you might have just cut out there for a second. I'll have to erase everything you just said about the Hornet, so it's fine. It's a little blip. I think the post production it'll show up, but there's different tools. That's the strengths and weaknesses. There's always the argument that pops up. Like for instance, like the F-35 will never replace the A-10. Yeah, sure. Yeah, the A-10 is a close air support machine, but the A-10 is going to soak up a bunch of double-digit SAMs in about the first nanosecond of any like contested fight. So it's just knowing the strengths and weaknesses and using the right tool for the right problem.
Yeah.
The trek into Afghanistan from the boat, I'm sure it depended on how far away the boat was, and the boat's always moving. But like going into Iraq, going into Afghanistan, if you're down there in the Gulf, like that's not a short sortie from just getting into country, doing the vol, and coming back.
No, yeah, it's not at all. It was different. When we were in the Med flying into northern Iraq, it was a long transit to go through Turkey. And usually once you'd get to northern Iraq, that's where the tankers were. So you'd fly in, you'd hit the tanker to top off, and then you'd have, depending on your cycle, because everything's based on cycles on the carrier and when you have to recover by, you would maybe have 2 or 3 vols. And so you'd hit the tanker, top off, go into, we called them kill boxes, an area where you check in with the JTAC on the ground and work with them to see if they had any work for you. And then you go back to the tanker, top off, and then back for another vol, and then maybe top off one more time before heading back home. It's a different story when you're in the North Arabian Gulf and you're flying in through the south. I mean, it's usually a little bit shorter transit. You're in Iraq almost immediately. So, but Afghanistan was completely different. I mean, there was, long transit times. Those missions, routinely were 8 hours long. Just, the bulk of it is really just transit to and from.
Yeah, that's always painful to add like an extra hour and a half or 3 hour drive to work and then go to work and then drive back for a couple more hours.
Yeah. And then have to land on a boat. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about boat landing stuff. Cause that again, just sounds absolutely terrifying to me. What are some of your first experiences landing on the boat like?
Well, I'll tell you, my very first experience was in the T-45, which, if many people don't know this, but when you go to the carrier for the first time, you're by yourself because no instructor is stupid enough to get in your back seat. And as an instructor, I can honestly say that's true. But so my first time landing on the boat in the T-45 was out of Jacksonville, Florida. And day one of the detachment, I was not flying, so I had a day off. And on that day, my on-wing instructor, so the person that taught me basically how to fly the T-45 in the very initial stages, the familiarization stages, he crashed into the water and died. And and that was day one. And so that night they had an all officers meeting, and they got everyone together. They kind of said, "Hey, this is what happened." And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's it. We're going back to Kingsville. I mean, I'm not going to go tomorrow. I guess I'll have to come back another time. And then they looked at me and were like, "Stewart, you ready to go in the morning?" And I was like, wait, somebody just died. Like, are we still doing this? But that's, that was kind of my first realization of, hey, naval aviation, military aviation, it just doesn't stop. It doesn't stop because, someone dies, as tragic as it is. And so the next morning, bright and early, sun hasn't even come up, and I was going, and it was me and two other students, and then an instructor who was leading us out there. So it was a 4-ship. The instructor leads us into the break. He will usually land, and they pump him full of gas, and then we usually do a touch and go the first time. So the first time that you're actually seeing a carrier is a touch and go, and so do the touch and go, and then come back around and land. And I don't remember any of it. I mean, it was 100% muscle memory because you just practiced so much of the field that I was just completely oblivious to what was happening until I was stopped, chalked and chained on the deck, getting gas, looking around and going, I can't believe that I am in a jet on a boat in the middle of the ocean. It was just the most surreal experience. And honestly, that never really went away. That feeling kind of complete and utter shock and amazement just stayed with me my entire career.
I made it on the boat. This is a huge win. Your on wing that was killed was landing mishap or spatial disorientation?
So what
it was?
What we think happened, and this is what the accident report said, is that he had a backseater with him who was I believe was an Air Force A-10 guy that was just going out for a good deal right out to the boat. And the leg restraint lines, so you have straps that are around your upper thighs or right above your knees, and then around your ankles that pull your legs into the ejection seat if you have to eject. What they think happened is that the backseater's leg restraint lines were kind of twisted so that when he entered the brake, the stick in the back got caught in those leg restraint lines, and so he basically just broke right into the water. Couldn't right the jet. They both tried ejecting but were inverted at that point, and so they both just ejected into the water and pretty much killed instantly.
Man, that sucks. That's not the most elegant way I could put that. Do you know how many carrier arrested landings you have?
I don't know exactly how many I have. I stopped counting after about 300. But somewhere between 300 and 400.
Yeah, well, that's fine. I feel like all the Navy guys know how many landings they have, which I like to poke fun at. Like, I don't know how many landings I have. Like, I don't know. Took off, I landed. But I know landing on a boat's a whole different thing in itself. So
know exactly how many you have when you're in a boat squadron, that is constantly deploying, because every single landing is something that you have to look at on a board. There's called a greenie board. Every landing's graded, and your squadron has a board up. And if you get a good grade, it's green. If you get a bad grade, it's yellow. A really bad grade is brown. And so you can walk into any ready room on the ship and see, oh man, he's having a rough time. He's got a lot of browns on there. and so, how many landings you have and how well or not well you're doing, when you're doing it. But my last squadron, we were originally, a reserve deployable squadron, back in 2003, the last Navy Reserve Hornet Squadron deployed. That was actually on my deployment. So I cruised with a bunch of reservists, VFA 201. When 201 disestablished, 204 ended up being the last deployable squadron. So for a while, we did have to go to the carrier and we did have to requalify. But then they decided that was too expensive. We're just going to be adversary only, and so they did away with that.
Interesting. Well, I guess would that have been like the Dobbins guys out of Marietta, Atlanta?
So that was 203, and they went away around the same time that 201 did. I can't remember
Yeah.
what year that
That's
was.
what I feel. I mean, that's obviously where I'm from, but I remember the
Yeah.
Hornets up there at Dobbins, probably just definitely after the Afghanistan kickoff, but maybe they were gone before Iraq kicked off or right after it. But because that was a combat coded Hornet squadron. It wasn't an adversary squadron.
Yeah,
correct?
it was. And I mean, at the time, all the VFAs were so VFA 201, VFA 204, VFA 203, and then you had the VFCs, and those were the ones that were historically adversary. When they did away with VFA 201, which also did adversary work, then they started giving more and more adversary duties to VFC 12, VFA 204. That's around the time that VFC 111 stood up. Originally, they were a VFC 13 det in Key West, and they decided, hey, we just need a permanent presence here. Let's stand up a new squadron. And so that's when VFC 111 stood up. So, yeah, they just they did away with, that, like I said, that reserve air wing. You're no longer going to have a reserve air wing go on a carrier. And I don't foresee a time when we will ever have, a reserve TAC air squadron deploying again.
Interesting, because it's quite opposite in the Air Force with reserve and guard squadrons, which are almost like active duty squadrons at this point, as far as like their ops tempo and deployment cycles, et cetera. One thing you bring up that I need, it's a point of contention I have with the Navy, which there are a few, but the VFA, the VFCs, the CVNs, all like I have no idea what any like who comes up with this stuff, because VFA is a strike fighter squadron, right?
Yep. Yep, that's right.
What's
Strike
a VFC?
So that was a composite fighter squadron. So traditionally, adversary squadrons had more than one airframe. So they would usually have F-16s, F-5s, A-4s.
Okay.
So if you had more than one platform, you should have been a VFC. Well, that's now gone away. So now VFC is strictly adversary. So
okay. Then so CVN, I see that paint on the side of like carriers. The N, is that nuclear?
yes, yeah.
What's the C? What's the V? There's a lot of V's. I don't know where the V comes from.
V is fixed wing. I don't know why V is fixed wing, but that's what it is. So CV is a fixed wing carrier nuclear. So that's what CVN is.
Okay.
So that's why
I'll just chalk it up to that's Navy things.
Yeah,
right
there's
there.
a Navy
I'm like,
thing.
I don't understand this logic.
There's a lot of things that I don't understand about the Navy, and it just kind of press the I believe button and move on.
Yeah. You probably could say the same thing for Air Force, like the nomenclature with like KC-135, like K is for tanker, like Y is K for tanker. I guess T was for trainer, so we had to go with another letter there. Because it also pairs into like the Navy enlisted side of the house. I have no idea when it's like, hey, I'm boatswain men 5 petty officer. I'm like, I don't know what you are. Are you like an E5, an E4? Like, have you been in the military for 10 years or 2 years? You look old, so I'm going to assume it's been more, maybe 10 years, but it's fun to always do that integration. And I think people too, who aren't in the military, it's good to hear this stuff because we're all doing the same thing and like have the general same objectives going the same way, but there's completely different languages. And when you hear someone who's gone from the Army to the Air Force to the Navy, etc., like it is a whole new set of acronyms that they have to learn, and different offices are doing different admin functions. Like it's all kind of the same, but it's all very different in itself. So I do get a chuckle when you're
absolutely. And that's been the coolest thing about my joint experiences is kind of getting to see the way different organizations work. So I did one with the Joint Special Operations Air Detachment, and they said, okay, you're going to be the J3, and that's going to be like the DO. And I'm like, what's a DO? And they're like, well, it's kind of like, you're kind of like the second command. You're kind of like the operations officer. And I'm like, so kind of like an XO in the Navy. Okay, I can do that. So I had to put everything into Navy terms just for me to figure out what my role was.
Which I will give the Navy this, like it makes sense, like at least on the officer side ranks, like a commander is typically it's an O5, which is typically leading a squadron in the Air Force. Right. But for us, it's a lieutenant colonel.
Yeah.
And then a captain makes sense in the Navy because you're the captain of the ship, and that's usually who's leading the ship. It's like, oh, I can understand that. And then, someone just got poked in the eye and jumbled the Ouija board or whatever when they decided to come up with the enlisted side with the ranks. But it's like, I don't know what you are. Yeah, it's when you compare that. So now for those listening to or watching, you start thinking about all the joint stuff we do. So we think when we talk joint, we're talking U.S. forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, or the combined doing coalition operations. Mm-hmm. Now you're mixing other nations, navies, armies, and air forces in and amongst the U.S. and now having to go out there and speak that common lingo. This is something that I think over the years it progressively gets better for the most part, but it takes a lot of work from smart people who are Top Gun instructors, weapons officers, doing that integration piece to bring all of this together so that when we have a combined objective, we can go out there and fight and win together.
Right.
What did you do any kind of deliberate combined strikes when in your initial deployments there in Iraq, or was it mostly all U.S.? That was probably all U.S. led at that time, I imagine.
It was all U.S. There were some ad hoc interaction or integration with Air Force. We never really planned anything to do with Air Force, but there was one mission I flew on my first deployment. There was this surface to air site that had been targeting coalition aircraft, and they said, I want you to take it out. And I was carrying the JSOW, so the Joint Standoff Weapon, which, for those who don't know, you drop it glides a certain distance, and then depending on the type, we'll either just drive in like a normal bomb or we'll open up bomblets. I was carrying the kind that had bomblets. So it was perfect for taking out a surface to air missile site. And it was perfect for not going into the missile engagement zone either. But they said, we want BDA, so we want you to follow it in. I'm like, that's kind of not the point of having a standoff weapon, but okay. So I was a little bit nervous, a little bit hesitant, and I hear this voice, on the radio, kind of a tinny sound on the radio saying, I'll go with you. And I'm like, I have no idea who that is. I mean, I found out later it was a CJ, right? So it's somebody that was to protect me from, missiles with harm and, all the other stuff that the Gucci stuff they have. But I had no idea what it was. So I just, drop the JSOW, kind of truck into the, zone, got my FLIR up, and out of the corner of my eye, I'll never forget, out of the corner of my eye, I see this kind of blossom, build on the ground. And I was immediately thinking, heads up, missile launch, tell my wingman. And he goes, dude, that was your JSOW blowing up. And then I look at my FLIR and I can see all the little bomblets impacting. So what I thought was a missile launch, bloom, it was actually just all my bomblets blowing up.
That's awesome. Talk to me a little bit about the transition, getting out of the Navy, retiring, going into the airline world, and then writing a book. What was that like?
Well, the nice thing is, I always say that being in the reserves was great because it allowed me to keep one foot in. So when I initially left active duty, I did not want to be an airline pilot. I thought it would be boring. So I got another job, realized I didn't like working for a living. So I went back to the idea of being a pilot full time. So that's how I ended up being an airline pilot and, balancing the two. My squadron liked to have 10 to 12 days a month, usually, drill weekend and then, half of a detachment, something like that. But I got to balance the two, right? So if I was frustrated with my civilian job, I'll go fly with the Navy. If I was frustrated with the Navy, I just stiff arm them and go fly with the civilian job. So that was great. I got a nice transition, a really long transition period where I could do that. My last deployment was with JSOC, and I got to see a lot of really cool things that I don't think a lot of people ever really know about. I mean, and rightfully so, right? That kind of world needs to stay quiet. But what really struck me are the people I worked with, and the people, the kinds of people that I thought didn't exist in our military anymore. You start to get jaded. You start to think the greatest generation doesn't exist anymore. And I mean, I can affirmatively state that the greatest generation is the generation that's out there right now. And it's the people who have, risen the ranks, maybe are more political, that are keeping them held back. So I decided I wanted to write a book, and I wanted to kind of touch on that. Maybe not the exact experiences I had, but the kinds of people that I worked with. And so I wrote a book. It took me, I don't know, a good 6 years probably to write it, and didn't sell it, didn't do anything with it. And then I realized once I finished one, I could write another. And so now I'm an airline pilot, and on my overnights, I'd sit in the hotel room, and instead of turning on the TV and making myself dumber, I'd just open up my laptop and start writing. And I wrote 5 novels before I finally found an agent who believed in me and signed me. And then, and now I have deadlines and stuff I have to actually meet.
Yeah. Well, now with ChatGPT, I mean, those deadlines aren't even a factor. You just have it write it for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that not how it works?
Yeah, no, that's don't tell everyone my secret. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to write one this afternoon. So you got, is Unknown Rider that's coming out November 21st?
Yes. Unknown Rider comes out November 21st. That's my first one. It's kind of timely right now because of what happened with the Marine F-35B, going missing, and everyone talking about, was it hacked or whatnot. I mean, that's essentially what Unknown Rider is about. And I'm not the first person to write about this. I mean, obviously, more accomplished writers like Brad Taylor wrote about it in American Trader. Admiral Stavridis, who was my strike group commander on one of my deployments, he wrote about it in 2034. But what I wanted to really address is, what is a pilot experiencing when his aircraft is hacked and he can't control it? And what does that look like from a pilot's perspective? So everything that I write about, I try to evoke the emotions that you and I might feel when we lose control of our airplane and can't do it, and maybe it's for nefarious purposes and we want to get to the bottom of it. And so I try to give everyone a glimpse into what life is like as a fighter pilot. But that's it's not pretty fortuitous that this F-35 went missing last week.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear, or just to think about, because it's something I never thought about. There's obviously software in the F-16. There's software in the F-18, a ton of software and code, right? But now as you go to the F-35 and future ones, like you log into the F-35,
right?
Like you got your unique password and stuff. So
right.
Just what a different world and how it's changing. So I can only imagine what the future holds. So interesting. I'll have to check that out. I'm looking forward to get a chance to read that. And again, that comes out here in a few weeks. Where can people find you? Can they find the book, etc.?
Yeah, well, the book should be available anywhere books are sold. So most likely, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all those kind of places. My website is jackstewartbooks.com. And I'll make a plug for that too. If you get the book and there's a term that you don't, recognize because it's unique to military or to aviation, you can go to my website. There is a glossary that I will update for every single book in the series. This is a 4-book series. The second one will come out in February. And so, yeah, the glossary of terms is there. And, you can...
Is CVN and VFA and VFC
I'm going to have to go back and look. I think it might be. But...
Nah, you're going to have to update that.
Yeah. Well, now that I'm writing, taking notes right now. CVN, VFA. Okay, got it.
Yeah. And Navy enlisted ranks.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I'm on all the social channels too. So Instagram, Jack Stewart Books, Twitter, I guess it's called X now. It's just Jack Stewart Book, no S because there's too many letters.
It might be charging for that soon. Elon's, he's finding a way. He's gonna charge people for it. So.
And I might not be in there anymore.
Yeah, so I don't know if I want to pay for this.
Yeah, but that's where you can find me. I'm really excited about this book coming out, and I've had a few people read it that are in the know. One of my good friends was the first F-35 RAG CO, and he read it and he's like, man, I don't know how you got all this information. And I'm like, it's all open source. There's nothing secret in it. And then the first person to go through Top Gun and the F-35 read it as well. So I try to make sure that everyone has a very authentic look at what life is like. But it's definitely not just aviation. There's a lot of espionage in there as well, and it's kind of how the two worlds collide. I think that makes this series unique because that'll exist in all the books.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I mean, ChatGPT, it has access to all the databases, so it just pulls those facts.
Exactly. That'll have access to my book.
Yeah. No, well, I appreciate you hanging around and joining me on the podcast, sharing a little bit of your story, hearing about the book. If you're willing to hang around here for just a little bit, we'll do a There I Was segment. And I appreciate you taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
15,000 target.